today's topic is Buddhism in India, decline and revival. So there'll be basically two parts. First, we'll look at what is it that led to the decline and eventual disappearance of Buddhism in India, and subsequently the revival. Okay. Okay, so let's see the first slide. Let me see if I can get the first slide. Okay. Now, when we look at this, I think first of all, we look at who the Buddha was. When the Buddha was alive, he has an attractive personality, and you know, everybody knows that he has a great following. So when he was alive, the Sangha under him operated very harmoniously. And we know that the laity was also very much supported the Sangha. And we also know that the royalty also supported the Sangha. So Buddhism was, when the Buddha was alive, was actually progressing very well in the country. However, when he passed away, the Sangha struggled to remain relevant and also to maintain its dignity. Now, if we look at the timeline, for example, you find that Buddhism in India, you could actually look at it from various phases. What I would call the consolidation phase, all right? This is like from 486 to 274 BCE. Now, BCE stands for before the Common Era, right? Or sometimes it's called BC, but we have included the before the Common Era. So the numbers decrease, as you can see, yeah? Then from 486 to 274, then 275 to 200. So that's the period where Buddhism was well propagated in India. And then from the CE will be referring to the Common Era, or AD, Common Era, from 200 to 400. So the numbers now increase, yeah? So you can see the earlier part, the numbers decrease. And then when it comes to Common Era, it increases now. So 200 to 400, that's where Buddhism became a popular religion in India. But at the same time, for the next 200 years, it was also struggling for survival. And by 700 to like 12th century, there was a decline. And people like to say that from the 12th century onwards, Buddhism almost disappeared. Okay. Now, many scholars have said that Buddhism disappeared because of the Muslim invasion. That may not necessarily be true, because by the time the Muslims came and invaded India, Buddhism was actually in a very weak state. So what they did was basically just, you know, they actually saw Buddhism at its very, very weak state. In fact, later on, I will explain that. And from 1850 onwards, there was some kind of a revival in India until today. So if you look at Buddhism in India itself, you can actually roughly categorize into that period. Okay. So now, what would be the reasons for the decline of Buddhism in India? All right. Many reasons were given. I think essentially we can zero in down to maybe a couple of significant, very major factors. Now, one is the loss of royal patronage. I will give details subsequently. And then the idea of the laity, right? Not institutionalized. There was a lax in monastic discipline. There was also a revival of Hinduism, or what is called Vedic Brahmanism, which eventually evolved into Hinduism. And then the assimilation of Buddhism into Hinduism. And finally, the attack from the Turks or the Muslim invaders. So scholars generally agree that the decline or the reasons for the demise of Buddhism in India can be attributed to the following factors which I've mentioned above. Now, if we look at each one of it, right? Now, if you look at the first one, for example, you remember that when the Buddha passed away in Kusinara, and then within 3 months, we had what is called the first Buddhist council in Rajagaha. Rajagaha today is Rajgir, okay? And when the first Buddhist council was instituted, it was also supported by the royalty, by King Ajatasattu. And those of you who are familiar with Buddhist history, you will remember that King Ajatasattu was was one of the sons of King Bimbisara, who actually killed King Bimbisara. He killed he committed patricide actually. But anyway, subsequently he supported the Sangha and he was patron of the first Buddhist council in Rajagaha. Now, 100 years later, when there was a second Buddhist council, historians are of the opinion that Buddhism was still flourishing. So Buddhism was still in a very strong state of affairs. And then we have the third Buddhist council, which was something like 2 centuries later. And this was the period under King Ashoka, all right, who lived from 304 to 232. So all this is before the Common Era, right? All these are before. So it's BCE. Now, it was actually during Ashoka's time that Buddhism, you can say, reached its peak in India, because Ashoka also sent missionaries beyond India. I think many of you know about Ashoka sending missionary, sending his own son and daughter, Venerable Mahinda and Venerable Sanghamitra, to Sri Lanka. All right, so Buddhism actually reached its peak during that period. But at the same time, after King Ashoka, when there was another king, Pushyamitra Sungha, was like in the 2nd century before the Christian era, when he killed the last Maurya king. King Ashoka was from the Maurya Empire, or the Maurya dynasty. So Pushyamitra was actually one of his generals who actually killed the last Maurya king, usurped the throne. And when he did that, he actually revived Brahmanism. By reviving Brahmanism, he suppressed Buddhism. So there was the first time in history that we found that Buddhism was kind of persecuted. All right. So, but the situation was still not so bad, right? Because subsequently, when the Greeks invaded northwest India, you are familiar with the story of Alexander the Great, all right? So when he invaded what was then known as Asia Minor, but unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, Alexander the Great died very young. So when he died, all the land that he conquered in India, around that area, they were broken up into small kingdoms. And what is interesting is that some of the Greeks, they actually adopted Buddhism. Now, you may not be familiar with this name, King Meander, but I'm sure you have heard of this Milinda. You know, there's this Buddhist text called Questions of King Milinda, Milinda Panha, where there was this dialogue between the Venerable Nagasena and King Milinda. So historians have discovered that actually this King Milinda was actually a Greek king by the name of King Meander, one of the generals that was left behind when Alexander the Great died. So some of these Greek leaders did not actually return to Greece, but stayed on in India. And one of them was this King Meander. Okay, so it is also from the Greeks that subsequently you find Buddha images. And I think some of you would realize that the early Buddha images look very much like the Greek gods of Apollo, for example. Right? Even the attire that the early Buddha statues had. So those were the influence of the Greeks. Now, what is important is that the Greeks, they adopted Buddhism. They were very sympathetic, favorable to Buddhism. And Buddhism continued to grow, all right, and find a very congenial environment during the time of the Greeks, okay? And also, subsequently, there was this king, King Kanishka, all right, from the Kushan Empire. Now, King Kanishka lives like from 78 to 120 of the Common Era. So he was also like King Ashoka in propagating Buddhism. And it is said that it was under King Kanishka that you have the Fourth Buddhist Council, which was held in Kashmir. Now, I think the Theravada tradition don't actually recognize this Fourth Buddhist Council, but nevertheless, in history, it is said that it occurred. And the Fourth Buddhist Council in Kashmir was when the Sarvastivada tradition was present. And it was at the time when Mahayana took its final shape. So, so we do have emperors who were very supportive of Buddhism, as I just mentioned, starting with King Ajatasattu when the Buddha passed away, the first council, and then you have King Ashoka, who not only spread Buddhism in India, but also expanded Buddhism beyond the shores of India. And subsequently, in the 1st century, you have another king called King Kanishka. And at the same time, when the Greeks invaded Northwest India, they adopted Buddhism. So they too was sympathetic to Buddhism. So it was a good period as far as Buddhism was concerned in India. You know, King Kanishka even organized the Fourth Buddhist Council in Kashmir. Now, subsequently, however, just like you look at the history of Buddhism in China, there were periods when new dynasty took over and when Buddhism was persecuted. So likewise, after the Kushan dynasty, then there was the Gupta Empire. Now this was like from the 4th century to the 6th century, so about 200 years. And the Gupta Empire, depending on the kings, different kings, they practice a combination of Brahmanism and Buddhism, and sometimes predominantly Brahmanism. So when Brahmanism was the main religion adopted by the Gupta kings, then the Brahmins occupied the top ladder of society, all right? And it was also at that period that the caste system became more rigid. Now, it was during this period, during these 200 years, that Buddhism was neglected. Now, how do we know that? All right, Faxian referred to its decline in the Gangetic Valley during this period. Now, the problem with ancient India, right, at that time is that the Indians were actually never interested in history. So they never quite noted down dates of anything or any event. But fortunately, the Chinese were fanatical record keepers. And thanks to the visit to India by Chinese pilgrims, like subsequently you hear names like Xuanzang, I Ching, and Faxian, who lives in the 5th century, we actually know what happened to Buddhism in India. Okay, so this is an example. So by the 7th century, it is said that King Sasanka persecuted Buddhism, and this is also mentioned by Xuanzang during his travels. So there were periods where, you know, where Buddhism got persecuted because of different kings, right? Now, then in the 7th century, fortunately, there was another period where there was a king who was sympathetic to Buddhism. That's King Harsha. Now, King Harsha, who lives from 606 to 647, this is in the Common Era, Buddhism again reached its peak, all right? And Xuanzang saw over 1,000 monasteries and 50,000 monks. So this is the records from Xuanzang, okay? So as I said, thanks to the Chinese pilgrims, we were able to know what happened to Buddhism. Now, after King Harsha, there were no more royal patronage of Buddhism until the Palas, when they ruled East India. All right, the Palas Empire or the Palas dynasty was from 8th century to 12th century. Now, all the Pala rulers were Buddhists, but unfortunately, the Palas did not rule the whole of India. Okay, so India at that time was divided into 3 sections. So the Palas were only found in the northern region, like in Bihar and Bengal, and it ceased to have any hold in the rest of India. Right? And it was during this period that Mahayana Buddhism became very popular. So then the other king that we should remember now is Harsha, right? 7th century. So it was him that Buddhism also grew. And after that, there were no more royal patronage until the Palas. Okay. Now, the last Pala king, I've titled this slide as the last flicker. Right. So the last Pala kings continued to support Buddhism, but with very little success due to political troubles. As I said, the Palas Empire did not control the whole of India. It was just the area around Bihar and around Bengal. So Buddhism was active again during a very short period, like during Ramapala's time. And I call it the last flickering of the lamp, because the Pala reign was the last Buddhist empire, you can say the last glory of Buddhism in India. And then from then onwards, Buddhism continued to decline until it was finally ousted from India by Turkish invaders in the 12th century. Okay? So Buddhism was already declining at that time. It was given a new lease of life when a king comes and, when there was a king who was sympathetic to Buddhism, so then Buddhism grew again. But after, when the king changed, when the next king follows Brahmanism or Hinduism, again, Buddhism fell. So that was why I mentioned in the earlier slide that one of the factors that made Buddhism grow was royalty. That means the support from the royal court. At the same time, the same reason that caused Buddhism to grow, which is the support from the royalty, was also the reason that Buddhism declined when there was no support from the royalty. Okay, so that's a very important point, and I think the study of Buddhism in India, we need to remember that. Now, there's a recent book, which was like 2013. This is by Dr. Lars Forgelin. Dr. Lars Forgelin is from the University of Arizona, if I'm not mistaken. Now, this is a survey of Buddhism in India from its origins in the 6th century, BCE through the rise, and its final decline from the 7th century onward. So because we don't have time to actually go into details, so what I'll do is to introduce to you some relevant books, and I hope that you could have access to it. This is called An Archaeological History of Indian Buddhism. Right? Now, I have one extract from this book here, which is in the next page. This is from this book, An Archaeological History of Indian Buddhism, so Dr. Lars, right? Now, this is what he said in his research. He said, when Buddhist monasteries became powerful political and economic institutions with extensive land holdings and wealth, the economic self-sufficiency allowed the Sangha to limit the day-to-day interaction with the laity and begin to more fully satisfy the ascetic desires for the first time. Now, this withdrawal from the regular interaction with the laity led to the collapse of Buddhism in India in the early to mid-second millennium of the Common Era. So Buddhism did not just decline overnight. It was a long, long process. So this is Dr. Lars lecturing research, okay? And you can find more details about in this book. So here he was basically talking about how the monasteries became so self-sufficient that they don't actually need to interact with the laity, all right? Now, if you remember, during the time of the Buddha had always emphasized the importance of the fourfold community, right? The parisat, as we say. First, you have the Sangha, the male, the monks, they got the nuns, then you got the male lay disciples and the female lay disciples. And the Buddha mentioned on many occasions that when this fourfold community or the fourfold Sangha gets together, that's where the Dhamma or the Sasana will be prolonged. The moment this fourfold community is disintegrated, the Dhamma will disappear. So you can see this very clearly in India when the monastics, when they isolate themselves in the monasteries, when they have no more contact with the laity, all right, then you find that one link in that fourfold community is destroyed. Okay. Now, the lay institution during the Buddha's time was very important, as I just mentioned, the fourfold community in the Parisat. So, but unfortunately, there was no homogeneous and distinct structure for the laity in Buddhism, as you have in other religions. When the Buddha was alive, he was able to attract people by his aura and simplicity. In fact, the Buddha set examples for the monks who stayed in villages or forests near inhabited areas. And the monks, they would come and interact with locals and teach them the Dhamma. You see the example in the life of the Buddha. He would walk in the morning on alms round, and when the laity gives him food, sometimes he and his monks get invited to the home, and in the homes, after the meals, he would give a short discourse. So this kind of interaction with the laity was very important. But unfortunately, there was no institution that actually created this distinct structure for the laity in Buddhism. All right, and because of that, when the monks stayed away from the laity, and the laity have no access to the Sangha, then you find that the whole structure collapsed. Okay, so this was what also one of the factors that historians have attributed to the fall of Buddhism in India. Now, so this is the third factor. You remember I said the first factor was lack of royal patronage. The second factor was because the monastics got themselves cloistered up into the monasteries because they were also self-sufficient, so they became deviated from the laity. So they spent most of their times like been very scholastic and not actually been able to relate to the lifestyles of the laity. Okay, so that's one of the factors. Now, in another book called The Decline of Buddhism by an Indian scholar, by Dr. KTS Sara from University of Delhi. Now, I've also extracted one part of this book where he quoted Chinese pilgrims Fa Xian, Xuanzang, and Yi Jing, who visited India in the 5th to 7th century. So these are the three well-known Chinese pilgrims who visited India. All right. Now, all three reported the degenerate lifestyles of monks who led luxurious life of alcoholic drinks, food, and sex. So monks also began to do business and own property. So what happened is quite obvious. Because of the misconduct of the monastics, it damaged the dignity of Buddhism seriously. So Buddhism became to have a very, very negative image in society in India. Again, this did not happen overnight. It happened over a long period of time. So this was during the time when Chinese pilgrims like Fa Xian, Xuanzang, and Yi Jing visited India. This was between the 5th to the 7th century. So you can read more about this in this book called The Decline of Buddhism in India, Dr. KTS Sara. Very interesting book. Now, this is not a book, but this is actually a research article which I managed to source. This is from Alexander Cunningham. He talks a brief historical sketch of the rise, progress, and Buddhism in India. It's a very old manuscript. You will be able to find this in the libraries, but I don't think you can find it in the bookstores. Now, this is what Alexander Cunningham said. Buddhism had in fact become an old and worn-out creed whose monks no longer beg the bread. Well, he have used words beg, but today we do not say the monks beg. The monks go on alms round. The monks are not beggars, right? The word bhikkhu is not translated as beggars, but this was written in 1854 by Alexander Cunningham. So he sees the monks on alms round. He said the monks went begging. So he said the monks no longer begged the bread, but were supported by property owner who have since appropriated to the monasteries. And then he used the word sramana. Sramana, I think if you're from the Theravada tradition, you're familiar with the word samana. All right, sramana is Sanskrit. So samana is the Pali equivalent. Ascetics, yeah? Sometimes you find in the Buddhist text, we say the samana Gautama, that means Gautama, the ascetic. So according to Alexander Cunningham, sramanas and bhikkhus are the monastic, the male monastics, were not like those of ancient days. They were learned and wise, and whose bodily abstinence and contemplative devotion, combined with practice, exaltation, holy example, excited the people and were a wonder. So according to Alexander Cunningham, writing in 1854, his research shows that Buddhism over a period of time had, no longer have monks who actually stick to the disciplines, to the rules that were set by the Buddha. And that led to the decline. Okay, so monastic decay, that's the other factor. Now, the other reason is assimilation, which is basically Buddhism's equality of caste threatened the high position of Brahmins, and its renunciation of animal sacrifice made the Brahmins insecure. Now, if you are familiar with basic Buddhist doctrines, you find that the Buddha was against the caste system. The Buddha was born within the caste system in India. He was actually born in the Kastriya or the Katiya caste, the warrior caste. But when he became the Buddha, Prince Siddhartha, when he became the Buddha, he admitted into the monkhood people from all over the castes, whether they were Brahmins, whether they were Katiya, they were Sudras, they were Vaishyas, even the untouchables, people who don't have a caste, they were all admitted into the Buddha's teachings. And there were many discourses. The Vassala Sutta, for example, the Buddha talks about, that it is not the caste systems, it's not the caste that makes one pure or impure, it's because of one's action. So when the Buddha talks about equality of caste, it literally threatened the position of the Brahmins, because the Brahmins were of the highest caste. But as long as Buddhism was supported by the royalty, there wasn't much the Brahmins could do. Okay? And during the Buddha's time, the Buddha also renounced animal sacrifice. All right? And in fact, the Buddha was known as the great compassionate one. So he was very much against what the Hindus, or no, I wouldn't say Hindus, the Brahmins at that time, or Brahmanism at that time, would do in terms of animal sacrifice. So that too made the Brahmins insecure. So of course, when Buddhism no longer had royal support, and when the king started adopting Brahmanism, then the Brahmins found that there was a good opportunity to actually dilute Buddhism and to assimilate some of its teachings into their practices. In fact, what Gandhi said was that modern Hinduism owes a lot to Buddhism, because it was a long period of time when many of the Buddha's teachings became absorbed into Hinduism, because the Hindus or the Brahmins realized that there was a lot in Buddhism that actually would refine their own tradition. So that's where the difference between, say a religion like Christianity or Judaism or Islam, where it is possible to say, if you're a Christian, you're definitely not a Muslim, or you're not a Jew. But in India, Buddhism, Hinduism tends to be a little bit more syncretic. And in the same with China, when Buddhism went to China, so the mental attitude of the Chinese, just like Indians, very much syncretic. So when Buddhism went to China, initially Confucianism had problems, initially Taoism had problems, but later they were able to blend very well. Okay, so likewise in India, this assimilation is when the Brahmins slowly became to adopt many of the Buddhist teachings and Buddhism, and became engulfed into Brahmanism. Now, the other point I think I should also mention here is that, for example, subsequently they even adopted the Buddha as one of the Hindu gods. All right, and that is why today, for example, you may find Indians who are Hindus going to Buddhist temples, going to pray to the Buddha. But in their minds, they regard the Buddha as an incarnation of Vishnu, as one of their gods. All right, so to them, the Buddha is not the fully enlightened one, but one of their gods, an avatar. You're familiar with this word called avatar, A-V-A-T-E-R. Okay, so the assimilation. So these are some of the factors. Now, the other factors, I'll go a bit, is on the external attacks. Now, this is from an article which is you can read on the the internet, it's called Who Destroyed Nalanda University. Now, it is said that the Arabs invaded India around 8th century and full of zeal for the spread of the new religion, laid a heavy hand upon the religious buildings of the Hindus and Buddhists. So Buddhist monasteries were no exception. Several thousands of monks were thrown into the fire, some beheaded. So millions others were forcibly converted to Islam. Okay, so this is the source here. You can read that. But as if you read, you know, the new research coming out that Buddhism did not just disappear because the Muslims came and destroyed Buddhism. Buddhism was already in stages of decay for different reasons, which I mentioned earlier on. Okay, so these were some of the reasons. Now, there's something interesting here, which I remember many years ago reading. It's from Abbot Konze, who was one of the first Buddhist scholars, whose books that I read when I was in university. This was where he quoted Xuanzang that the theory of ecclesiology was popular in India, as Buddhists believed that Buddhism would decline 1500 years after the Buddha passed away. Therefore, the monks did not retaliate because they practiced non-violence, as well as the belief in the theory of ecclesiology. Right? So it reminded me of this text. So I thought I'd just flip it here. But you can read. It's called A Short History of Buddhism, Abbot Konze. Right. Now, I've got a few sources here, so because I don't have time to go into details. So according to a few scholars like Randall Collins, Buddhism was already declining in India by the 12th century. So that was my earlier point. So, but with the pillage of Muslim invaders, it nearly became extinct in India. So in the 13th century, Craig Lockhart said Buddhist monks in India fled to Tibet to escape Islamic persecution, while the monks in Western India, states Peter Harvey. Peter Harvey is another very well-known Buddhist scholar, escaped persecution by moving to South Indian Hindu kingdoms. They were able to resist the Muslim power. But very much by the 12th century, it was really the dark age for Buddhism in India. So we call it the demise. Okay? So there are some sources here. If you have my slides, you can make reference to it subsequently. Okay, so those are the factors that causes the decline of Buddhism in India. So next part, I want to look into the revival timeline. So I've divided into 5 different phases. I call it the first phase from the 18th century, 1750 to 1891, when there were Buddhist archaeological finds. Second revival, when there were some Buddhist missionaries and anti-colonialism took place. And then the period of Ambedkar, some of you may have heard of his name, Ambedkar. And then the Tibetan diaspora, the Dalai Lama and the Nalanda tradition. And finally, today's soft power diplomacy, where Prime Minister Modi leveraged on India's geopolitical tool. Okay, so Buddhism, slow revival from the 18th century, starting with the Buddhist archaeological finds. So the first revival movement of Buddhism in India, this was prior to the advent of Ambedkar, can be divided into 2 periods, as I mentioned just now. Now, it was during this first period that Buddhism was rediscovered and brought back within public discourses. The activities in this period mainly included the discoveries of Buddhist shrines by archaeologists and literary communities. For example, today, many Buddhists would go to visit the 4 holy sites, right? But they were not discovered until very recently, all right? Like Mahabodhi, the Mahabodhi temple was overgrown with weeds and was like a forest, but subsequently it was discovered and the archaeologists discovered, hey, this is where, you know, the Buddha attained enlightenment, and Sarnath, for example. And subsequently they discovered places like Ajanta caves. So all those archaeological discoveries became to give a certain pride to the Indians that they are actually inherit a very rich heritage. So the second revival actually began in 1891. This was marked by missionary activities of this Sri Lankan monk, which I mentioned briefly in my earlier talk, named Anagarika Dhammapala, who also tried to revive Buddhism in India. So he created new interest in literature and started building Buddhist temples. So at the same time, it was also a period when Buddhism entered the anti-colonial movement, right? That there were already Indian activists, you know, who were against the British who were controlling India, right? So they look upon Buddhism as a heritage, a rich heritage that they could use, something that they could be proud of, all right? So all this very slowly, you know, created some interest in Buddhism. It actually made the Indians think, hey, we are actually we are the heirs of a very rich legacy. Okay, so these were the early period of the revival. So the excavations, right, which I mentioned early on, right? Actually, all these excavations I just want to mention were actually undertaken by Westerners, right? As you can see from the names there, right? Sir William Jones, and even had priests, for example, Padre Tiefenthaler, right? So many of them were discovered by the British, including Ajanta caves, who were accidentally discovered by 2 British soldiers. So when the British discovered this, the local Indians feel a sense of pride that actually they inherit such rich legacy. Okay, likewise, you know, Sarnath, where the Buddha preached his first sermon, it was only discovered as recent as 1837. Alexander Cunningham excavated Sarnath, all right? And then you got the Sanchi Stupa, right, like in the 19th century. So Buddhism has already disappeared from the face of India, you know, in the 12th century. So it took a few hundred years before archaeologists start rediscovering the glory of Buddhist art and architecture. Okay. Now, some of you may or may not have heard of Sir Edwin Arnold. Now, he was one of the first Europeans to study Buddhism. So because of all these archaeological excavations by the Westerners, so you find that the British in particular and Europeans, they became to take an interest in India. They find India not only exotic, but also rich in history. So Sir Edwin Arnold actually wrote a book of poem called The Light of Asia, and that's the Buddha, in 1879. And it became so popular that he was criticized when he went back to UK. And people in UK, his fellow Englishmen were telling him, how can you promote the Buddha who was a pagan? You should promote Christ. So it is said that he subsequently wrote another poem called The Light of the World, which was attributed to Jesus, but that book did not sell. Instead, the one that really became popular, that also raised the imagination of the Indian people, that, hey, now you've got a Westerner, a British, telling us about the light of Asia, about our great Buddha. So that was great. Okay. So that was an example of how Buddhism slowly came back to the mindset of the Buddhists in India, of the Indians in India, who were not necessarily Buddhist yet. Now, the next one I want to talk about before we end, because of time, is Ambedkar. Now, there's a lot we can talk about Ambedkar, but we don't have time. So I just want to introduce you to this book called Ambedkar and Buddhism. It's written by Sangharakshita, Ambedkar and Buddhism. This is written way back in 1986 and published by Sangharakshita's own organization called the Western Buddhist Order, Windhorse Publications. So this is a brief account of Ambedkar's career, describe why and how he became a Buddhist, and explain what Buddhism meant to him. Okay? Now, who is Ambedkar? Ambedkar, or Bhim Rao Ramji Ambedkar, all right, he was born an untouchable. You know, I mentioned that in India, they got 4 main castes. You got the Brahmins, you got the priestly caste, you got the warrior class, then you got the business class or the merchants, and then you got the lower caste called the Sudras. Now, outside of this caste is another group of people called the untouchables, who are so low in society that they don't even belong to any of the caste. They're not even in the fourth of the four classes. So they're called the untouchables, or the unscheduled caste. And it is said that in India, there are some 200 million of such people. Okay, 200 million. Okay, all right. So anyway, Ambedkar was born an untouchable, all right, but rose to become a jurist, economist, politician, and social reformer who campaigned against social discrimination on untouchables. It is rather strange that someone like Ambedkar was untouchable, but thanks to the prince, an Indian prince who somehow saw in him something that many other Indians did not see. So this prince of Baroda, I think that's the name of that princeling, supported him and supported his education. Ambedkar became India's first minister of law and chief architect of the Indian constitution. When India became independent in 1947, it was Ambedkar who drafted the Indian constitution. All right. And Ambedkar also holds doctorates from both Columbia University in the United States and the University of London. So he was highly qualified. But when he came back to India, he couldn't get a job because he was untouchable. He was untouchable. Okay. So many saints and reformers have actually tried to change the caste system, but it said that none of them were more successful than Dr. Ambedkar himself. Now, if you read that book, which I introduced earlier on, Ambedkar was at a crossroads. He drafted the constitution. The constitution says that all men are equal. In fact, they adopted like the French slogan, equality, liberty, equality, and fraternity. So Ambedkar introduced something similar to the Indian constitution. So, but he realized that whatever is mentioned in the constitution is just the legal aspects, but the mindset of the people are not affected by the constitution, will not be changed by the constitution. So he was at a crossroads. He realized that if he does not do anything, the 200 million Indians will continue to remain outcasts. So he had a choice by changing his religion. He said he wants to get out of Hinduism, which had a caste system. He had a choice of becoming a Muslim. He had a choice of becoming a Christian. But he felt that Christianity was too alien a religion to the Indians. And to Islam, he found that it was too antagonistic to many Hindus. Then he decided, he set for himself a criteria. He said he needs a religion that can cope with modern science, a religion that is rational, and a religion which teaches the equality of sentient beings. And he concluded the only religion that can do that was Buddhism. And he chose Buddhism. So what happened was, on 14 October 1956, Ambedkar took the 3 refuges and 5 precepts in Nagpur from a Buddhist monk, Nagpur in India, and then in his turn administered them to, it is said, 500,000 of the untouchables, including women and children who became Buddhists, thus bringing about the renaissance of Buddhism in India and initiating a religious and social revolution of major significance. So Ambedkar was able to bring in 500,000, 500,000 of Indians, all of whom were untouchables, including women and children, to take the 3 refuges, to take to recite the Buddhang Saranang Gacchami, Dhammang Saranang Gacchami, and Sanghang Saranang Gacchami, and to adopt the 5 precepts, to observe the 5 precepts. Okay, and it was at that time when Ambedkar became a Buddhist, publicly became a Buddhist, took the 3 refuges and 5 precepts. Venerable Sangharakshita was also there, the author of the book on Sangharakshita. And today, Venerable the late Sangharakshita, he has just passed away. His group called the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, especially a gentleman by the name of Lokamitra. All right, he has done fantastic work spent almost 40 years in India helping the untouchables who are now called the Dalits, D-A-L-I-T-S, the Dalits, okay? But unfortunately, Ambedkar did not live long to see the success of what he has done. It is said that after he officially became a Buddhist, the 3 refuges and 5 precepts, he passed away in 6 weeks. 6 weeks later, he passed away, okay? Now, besides that, the other factor that led to the rise of Buddhism, or created a very positive frame of mind among the thousands and millions of Indians in India, is the Tibetan diaspora. Some of you remember in 1959, when China sent troops into Tibet, the Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, he escaped from Tibet to India along with thousands of refugees. And thanks to the Indian government, he was allowed to set up a government in exile in Dharamsala. So in Dharamsala, many monks also came, and they start to establish monasteries and schools, making it a leading Buddhist center in the world. For example, today, the Buddhist Institute of Dialectics is also located in Dharamsala. Okay. Now, the popularity of the Dalai Lama attracted many foreigners to Buddhism. So what happened is, this also inspired many Indians to appreciate and follow Buddhism. And I think one of the things that really made the Indians proud that the Dalai Lama is staying in India is that he not only received the Nobel Peace Prize, but it was in India that many of these, what is called the mind-life dialogues between His Holiness the Dalai Lama and leading Western scientists, neuroscientists, psychologists, they were held. So every few years, this group of well-known Western scientists and psychologists, names like Richie Davidson, Daniel Goleman, the author of EQ, Emotional Intelligence, all right? Even John Kabat-Zinn, right? The one who popularized Vipassana meditation at the University of Massachusetts with his MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction techniques. So many of these great names in modern science or neuroscience, for example, have met with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, engaged in dialogues with him on Buddhism and science. Now, this obviously attracted not just foreigners, but the Indians themselves, who feel very proud that, hey, you have got a great Buddhist master on Indian land, on Indian soil, and he is bringing back the great tradition of Buddhism. Now, the other reason which the Indians find very attracted to the Dalai Lama is that because the Dalai Lama promoted the Nalanda tradition. Now, many of you remember that the Nalanda University was a great Buddhist monastery, what today we would call a university. It was there for many, many years, many hundreds of years. People believe that. And even like, for example, Atisha, the great Atisha, right, was from Nalanda, right? So His Holiness the Dalai Lama tries to promote that, look, it was in India itself, the great Nalanda University. They produced great pundits, great scholars. And in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, we talk of 17 pundits, all right, great scholars like Shantideva, Nagarjuna, Aryadeva, all those great names, okay, Atisha. So all these were Indians, so when His Holiness the Dalai Lama promoted the Nalanda Pandits to thousands of Indians who now realize that, again, they are heirs to a very rich tradition of Buddhist, of scholarship in their own country. So the Tibetan diaspora have helped a great deal, all right, in terms of bringing Buddhism back to the mainstream of Indian society, okay? But because the Indians are basically syncretic, so they may not necessarily give up Hinduism, which is their traditional or ancestral religion, but they become very sympathetic to Buddhism. They begin to practice, they begin to adopt many Buddhist practices. Like for example, it is said that vegetarianism, which was popularized in Mahayana Buddhism, all right, became popular in Hinduism because of Buddhism. So many Indians are vegetarians today because of the influence of Buddhism. Okay, the concept of ahimsa is also traced back to Buddhism. And when they start studying the story of Ashoka, who was a great Indian emperor, right, then they realize again their rich culture, rich heritage belongs to them. So that's the Tibetan diaspora. So the Tibetan diaspora also contributed. Right? So the fact that thousands of Tibetan monks left Tibet to settle in India, all right, of course, created a very positive image of Buddhism in India. At the same time, Buddhism became very popular in the West because of this Tibetan diaspora. Right? Many hundreds of great Tibetan masters have now resettled in the West, bringing Buddhism to the West. Okay. Now, the last point I just wanted to mention about is what I call it the soft power strategy. Now, the Modi-led government, Prime Minister Modi, for example, places emphasis on using Buddhism as a soft power in India foreign policy. And one of the more interesting manifestations of this initiative is the engagement in Buddhist diplomacy alongside similar attempts by China. Now, many years ago, some of you heard that China actually organized 2 international Buddhist conferences, the World Buddhist Forum, all right? And they even invited Master Xing Ying to China. Now, if you have been following the geopolitical narratives behind why China is doing that, because China is basically a communist country, but it is one way of trying to neutralize what India is also doing. So India have its own. India supported, for example, the setting up of you know, the what is called the Buddhist circuit, you know, because India happens to have the 3 of the 4 holy sites, right? Well, the place where the Buddha was born is today in Nepal, Lumbini, but Bodh Gaya, Sarnath, and Kushinara, they're all in India, as well as Nalanda, you know, Rajagaha, Savatthi. So all those are places which are very well known in terms of Buddhist pilgrimage, right? So by incorporating its Buddhist heritage as the basis for further diplomatic, economic, cultural, and strategic associations, all right? So the Modi-led government uses Buddhism as a soft power, but in the process, Buddhism became to have a positive image in India. So people are sympathetic to Buddhism. The young, the educated begin to see in Buddhism something which they did not find in Hinduism. That is the scientific and the scientific approach towards things. Okay, so I just give you some photos here. You'll find that the Modi would go to China and give Buddha statues, right, to Chinese monks in the presence of President Xi Jinping. He would go to Mahabodhi in the middle picture, but pray to the Buddha and Mahabodhi. He will go to Japan, meet up with Zen monks, Jodo Shinshu monks. He will go to Thailand on the left-hand side by meeting up with Thai monks, and he visits His Holiness the Dalai Lama. All right, he welcomes the Dalai Lama. He have regular meetings with the Dalai Lama. All right, and on the right-hand side, you know, he pays his respects to Tai Situ Rinpoche and all the other great Tibetan lamas who are staying in India, including, you know, the 17 Karmapa. Okay, so all these things, while as far as PM Modi is concerned, it helps him in his diplomatic journey in Southeast Asia and with the Buddhist countries of Thailand, Burma, Sri Lanka, Cambodia. At the same time, it also creates a very positive image for Buddhism in India. Okay? So when you look at it, because of that, Buddhism today, I'm just using an old census, 2011, which is about 10 years ago, reveals that there were today 8.4 million Buddhists out of 1.3 billion people. So it's still a very small, very tiny percentage, okay? They are mainly among the untouchables. They are now called Dalits, okay? Every now and then you may have heard about conversions, right? Like in 2019, you read about 1,500 Dalits became Buddhists in a ceremony at Sardar Patel Stadium in Ahmedabad. This event was organized by Taiwan's Fo Guangshan, Master Xing Yun. Okay, so a lot of support for the untouchables, a lot of support for the new Buddhists or the Ambedkarites, as they are called. Actually, a lot of support actually came from Taiwan. So Taiwan gives a lot of financial support to, for this new Buddhists. Okay, so today, even though it's a small, but we're talking about millions of Buddhists in India now, right? Whereas before Ambedkar, historians were saying there were probably about 130,000 Buddhists, and these 130,000 Buddhists were all predominantly in the Himalayan region, right? They maybe among the Tibetans, the Ladakhis, right? Some of the Sherpas, right? But today, because of what Ambedkar has done and because of the very good image that Buddhism has, I think some of you know that through Vipassana, names like Goenka, right? And they have even introduced Vipassana into the Indian prison system, right? So Buddhism became very popular, right? So today, Buddhism has got a good future to grow again back in its land of its birth. Okay, so I think I would just stop there and conclude by having a short prayer. Prayer on 4 sublime states. So may I wish all sentient beings have happiness and its causes. May all sentient beings be free of suffering and its causes. May all sentient beings never be separated from happiness and be always without suffering. And may all sentient beings be in equanimity, free of bias, attachment, and anger. May all be well and happy. Thank you. So we have about 30 minutes, as I promised you. So, and if you have some questions, please feel free to share your questions.
Okay, sadhu. Thank you, Brother Benny. Can you click on the chat? There is a question from Sandy.
Yeah. Sure. Is King Mienda the same person as King Milinda? Yes, according to many historians, King Mienda is the Greek name for King Milinda. So as I said, King Milinda is the king, what today we call the philosopher king, who had dialogues with this venerable Nagasena. One of the questions that was asked was, if you remember, is this person yesterday the same as the person today, and is the same person tomorrow? And the reply Nagasena gave was, na chaso, na cha ano. It's not the same, not different. Right? So if you get more details of this, if you read the Milinda Pantha, it's called Questions of King Milinda. Right? Okay, so. Okay, the concept of Chestology basically this belief that that the world will come to an end. So there's some belief that that Buddhism will not survive the next 500 years. So it's a belief, okay. But Buddhism has survived for right up till today. There's also a teaching saying that the teachings of the present Buddha, Gautama Buddha, will be totally forgotten. And then after a period of time, there will be a dark age where there'll be no teachings available, but still there will be Pacceka Buddhas. There will be these so-called silent Buddhas, right? Because at the time when nobody appreciates the Dhamma, so the Pacceka Buddhas, they fare lonely. So they just move on alone. They are called solitary Buddhas, okay? But today, I said that only happens when people no longer can remember the teachings of the Buddha. But today, I'm sure many of you, can remember many of the Buddha's teachings by heart, okay? So we are not in the Dhamma ending age yet. So the Buddha Sasana is still around, and we still have the Sangha. We still got many great masters, right? Though some of them have passed away, right? In the Theravada tradition, we still got many good masters. In the Mahayana tradition, we got people like Master Hsing Yin, right? In the Tibetan tradition, we still got His Holiness the Dalai Lama. We got the 17 Karmapa. So we still got many great masters. So we don't have to worry that we are in the Dhamma is gone. Okay. So is the present time now is Buddhist golden era? Well, a cardinal teaching in Buddhism that we learn is the concept of impermanence, isn't it? Concept of anicca. If you look at Chinese history, for example, more so than Indian history, you find there'll be periods when Buddhism was persecuted, Buddhism just disappeared. All right. But then after that, Buddhism came back. Like during the Tang dynasty, it was a flowering of Buddhism. You look at our own country in Malaysia. Buddhism was here as early as the 2nd century, isn't it? You look at the Merbuk, right? And then you remember the Sailendras, right? Sri Vijaya. So there was the height of the Buddhist empire in this part of the world. And you would have Atisha all the way from Bengal. He sailed all the way to Indonesia to find his master, right? Serlingpa, remember? He went all the way to Indonesia to study under Serlingpa. I don't know for how many years, 10 years maybe, before he finally goes to Tibet, to revive Buddhism in Tibet. So here you have Atisha going all the way to Asia. So is the present time now, is Buddhism? Any time can be the golden era if the followers continue to practice the Dhamma. Right? If the Sangha, if the monastics that we pay respect to, if they continue to follow the Vinaya that the Buddha set down, if we lay people continue to keep our precepts, that is the golden time. That is a golden era for the Dhamma. Okay. Well, how the Milinda Panha was not in the original Tipitaka. Why was it included now? Well, it was not included like last couple of years. Okay, historically there were only these 4 Nikayas, right? The long discourses, the Dikha Nikaya, then the middle length discourses, the Majjhima Nikaya, then the connected discourses, the Sangyutta, and finally the gradual sayings, the Anguttara Nikaya. And finally you got the Khuddaka Nikaya, so which is called the miscellaneous. So subsequently, all those texts were included into that as part of the Khuddaka Nikaya. Right? So it's gone through a long period of time. So you can say it as of course, the Milinda Panha is not the word of the Buddha in that sense, but is a dialogue between King Milinda, the Greek Meander, and the Venerable Nagasena. Okay. All right. So it's not included now. It's included many centuries ago. Okay. As Buddhism declined in India, it flourished in other countries. But what of the Theravada tradition? When did it take root and expanded in predominant? Well, the word Theravada actually, his historians have got many takes on that. But normally, modern Theravada, we attribute it as coming from Sri Lanka. When Emperor Ashoka sent his children, right, Venerable Mahinda, isn't it? And Sanghamita to Sri Lanka. So Buddhism took root in Sri Lanka. But it is said that subsequently it was in Sri Lanka that the Theravada tradition took root. You remember Buddhaghosa, right? Buddhaghosa, who compiled the Visuddhimagga, all right? Buddhaghosa was also Indian, but he went to Sri Lanka, and the Visuddhimagga became the classic commentary, right? So it was from Sri Lanka. Then from Sri Lanka, then he went to Thailand. He went to Thailand, went to Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, right? And when Buddhism declined in Sri Lanka during certain periods, you see, Buddhism also did decline in Sri Lanka when certain kings were not in favor of Theravada Buddhism. Then the Thai Sangha the Thai monks actually came to Sri Lanka to reordain monks in Sri Lanka and restart the ordination lineage. Right? For example, in Sri Lanka, I think you may be familiar, there are three main monastic lineages: the Siam Nikaya, the Ramana, and the Amarapura. Right? So you remember the first one is called the Siam Nikaya, S-I-A-M, Siam Nikaya. Siam Nikaya is the same Nikaya where our late Chief Reverend and even I think Venerable Saranankara and Venerable Dhammaratana, they all come from the Siam Nikaya. So the word Siam itself, you will realize that the word Siam means Thailand. So they trace it back to Thailand. And then there's another called Amarapura. All right, so they trace back to Burma, to Myanmar. Right? Now, Sri Lanka had not always been Theravada. Right? So that's something which you may or may not know. For example, in Sri Lanka, you also have got the major monasteries. You got the Mahavihara, and then you got the I can't remember the other monasteries. So it is said that when the Mahavihara became the dominant monasteries, and then the Mahayana teachings which are in the other monasteries became sidelined. So before long, eventually Mahayana disappeared from Sri Lanka. So the main predominant tradition became Theravada. Right? So today, Sri Lanka is the main Theravada nation, together with Thailand, Myanmar, and Cambodia, and Laos. Okay. So why Buddhism didn't foresee the need to have its teachings recorded in written form to avoid confusion and split into so many? Well, I started by saying that the problem with ancient India, right, is that the Indians were never interested in history. So they never noted down dates or anything of that matter. It's the Chinese, actually, thanks to the Chinese, who were actually fanatical record keepers. If not for Xuanzang, I Ching, and Fa Xian, we wouldn't even know what happened to ancient India. It's because of their records, all right? Okay. So during the Buddha's time, it was a period of what we call the oral tradition. Okay. So the Buddha's teaching was passed down orally, all right? And even today, maybe not in Malaysia, I'm not sure about Malaysia, but I'm sure in Sri Lanka or even in Myanmar, you would have monks, they are known as Banikas. You heard of the word Banikas? Banikas, that means they are able to remember, they are able to recite the entire Pali Canon. In 1956, when we had the Buddhist, what do you call it? The Fifth Buddhist Council in Rangoon, in Yangon, I think it was Venerable Mahasi Sayadaw who was able to, he was able to recite the entire Pali Tipitaka. Right? So that's the tradition that was brought down all these years. Okay. So I don't think it's a question the Buddha did not foresee the need to have his teachings recorded. Anyway, during the Buddha's time, nothing was written down. Okay, it was all passed down through oral tradition. Okay. Well, his teachings, I'm not sure what's the question here. His teachings recorded in written form to avoid confusion and split into so many segments. Well, as I said, during the Buddha's time, there was no written text. You know, the Buddha's teachings were only recorded on ola leaves in Sri Lanka many, many hundred years after that. I'm sure you know that, yeah. So now, historians, if you read this book by David Kalupahana, some of you may remember this name, David Kalupahana, Sri Lankan philosopher and author. He wrote a book called The Historical Analysis of Buddhism. Now, if you read that book, he explains that when the Buddha passed away, he deliberately did not identify a successor, right? He said, let the Dhamma be a refuge. Now, because of that, when the Buddha was not around, people then began to you know, after generations, people spent a lot of time trying to understand what the Buddha actually taught. All right? So different people in different parts of India, they could have heard certain aspects of the Buddha's teachings. And when they hear those aspects of the teaching, so they explain it from their perspective. And because Buddhism is very much through one's experience, so then a particular monk, because of his long years of experience, he had certain experiences. So because of his experience, he started sharing that experience with his devotees. And over a period of time, these experiences are passed down through generations. So eventually they were put down in writing. They were recorded down. Right? So that is why eventually you have different so-called variations. Okay? But if you are an astute student of Buddhism, you find that no matter what kind of tradition or teachings or practices, it doesn't run away from certain basic core teachings. And these core teachings will be like the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path. So whether you are a Theravada, you are a Mahayana, you are a Vajrayana, you will always have the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. If someone comes to talk to you and say, oh, I follow this yana, there's only sevenfold path, then you know it cannot be correct. Because Master Hsing Yin will talk about eightfold path. His Holiness the Dalai Lama will talk about eightfold path. Sakya Trizin will talk about eightfold path. The 17th Karmapa will talk about eightfold path. All right? Ajahn Chah also talks about eightfold path. So everybody who is an authentic Buddhist teacher talks about the eightfold path. So we need not worry too much about all the variations. Just stick to the Eightfold Path. Practice our precepts, practice our meditation, and realize and have right views and right thoughts. Okay? Okay, let me see if I miss out any questions. Okay. Okay. Let me see. Sungai Batu relics points towards Mahayana lineage, but Venerable Sona and Uttara, who were sent to Suvarnabhumi, not practitioners of that tradition. Now, in the early years, now, for example, some of the early archaeological excavations that we found, for example, in the Bujang Valley, all right. So all those would apparently be what today we would call Mahayana. All right, we have statues of Tara, we have artifacts of Tara, or Avalokiteshvara. So those today we would associate with Mahayana. These two monks, Sona and Uttara, when they came to Suvarnabhumi, we don't really know what tradition they practiced. And do not forget that in early Buddhism, there were many schools of thought. And they were talking about as something like 18 different schools. All right. Today, the only school that from so-called the early schools that survive today is the Theravada. All right. And even Theravada you can trace back. There are other names before the word Theravada came in. You got Vaibhashikas, you know, even the word Staviravada. You know, there was a school called Staviravada. Stavira, actually, the word Stavira is the Sanskrit word for Theravada. Tera. Tera is the Pali word, right? Tera. The Sanskrit word is Stavira. Right? Tera. So Tera means, what does the word Tera mean? Tera means an elder, isn't it? Elder. All right. So in Thailand, they like to cut short the words. Like instead of saying Kamma, they say Kam. Instead of saying Buddha, they say Bud. So instead of Tera, they say Te. Te. So that is why you got our former Prime Minister, Mahathir. So Mahathir in Pali became Mahathera. The Te there is a Tera. So he's the great elder. He is at 94 years old, isn't it? So, of course, you know, our Malay language, you know, originates from Sanskrit. And Pali is not really a language. Pali means text, right? So the dialects during the Buddha's time, historians would tell you that the Buddha did not speak Pali. The Buddha spoke a Magadhi dialect, okay? And Prakrit was one of those dialects that was used during the Buddha's time. Okay? We use it Prakrit. Okay. So and those days the monks, they could, you know, be practicing Savastivada, Mula Savastivada, Sautrantikas, we do not know. But the early texts, for example, called the Agamas, you know, just now I mentioned to you that we have the 4 Nikayas, right? The Dikha Nikaya, the Majjhima Nikaya, the Samyutta Nikaya, and the Anguttara Nikaya, the 4 main texts besides the Khuddaka Nikaya. Now, the early Buddhist traditions, okay, they also have something similar in Sanskrit. So you have the Pali Dikha Nikaya, there's also a Sanskrit version to it. Just as you have the Pali Majjhima Nikaya, you also have got a Sanskrit version. All right. Likewise, the Samyutta called the Sangyukta in Sanskrit, and the Anguttara Nikaya in Pali is Sanskrit called the Ekottara Nikaya or Ekottara Agamas. So we call Nikayas in Pali and they call it Agamas. So those were the early Buddhist texts. Okay. And if you need to know more about this, talk to Venerable Sujato. Some of you know Venerable Sujato. I think he's quite an expert he has started this called Sutta Central. Sutta Central. So he has also studied the Chinese Agamas. Right? Okay. So there are many schools during the early period. How accurate is the Ola leaf since oral tradition was widely practiced? Now, we never regard the Buddhist texts as gospel truth, isn't it? Do we? Do we regard the Buddhist text like a Christian would regard the Bible? No, because the Buddha is told us in the Kalama Sutta, isn't it, that you do not take even my own teaching as the truth until you have studied it, verified it, you have analyzed it, and then you know it is true. So the texts are actually a guide. All right, it's a guide. It's not an end in itself. All right? So please do not regard the text as an end in itself. It's a guide for us. Okay, in a very famous Tibetan text, there's a Tibetan scripture called the Tattva Samgraha. So in the Tattva Samgraha, there's a saying which goes like, you must test the Buddha's teachings as you test gold under fire. So you test the teachings as you test gold under fire. So if you read the Pali text itself, of course I mentioned the Kalama Sutta. There's another very interesting text called the Vimamsaka Sutta. Vimamsaka Sutta. In the Vimamsaka Sutta, the Buddha talks about the importance of investigation, importance of inquiry. All right, and the Buddha even asked his disciples not to just trust what he said, but to find out for themselves if what he said is true. You see, that is the kind of confidence that the Buddha has in what he has taught is the truth. Because once you are so confident that what you teach is the truth, you are not worried. You don't worry for people to come and analyze what you have just said. But when you are not very sure about what you teach, then you like to tell people, please, you must have faith. You must believe in me. All right? So in Buddhism, belief doesn't arise. All right? Belief doesn't arise. That is why right views consists of right, it starts with right understanding, not right belief. Okay? All right? So please remember, the Ola leaves are important because it provides us a good introduction to the world of the Buddha's teachings. All right? So we should find out for ourselves, practice it. Okay? Let's see. Any more questions? Another 5 minutes. Okay. Someone clarify. Mahasi Sayadaw was not the monk who chanted the whole Tipitaka. Okay, great. So it was a mistake. It was a different Sayadaw at the annual chanting recorded again. Okay. All right. Ashoka in the third council had flushed out fake and schism causing monks and firmly assumed Theravada. Was that not right? That is right if you adopt it from the Theravada tradition. Okay. All right. If you follow the Theravada tradition, that is the way that the Theravada tradition says that yes, Asoka was a staunch Theravada, but the historian also say that Ashoka was open to all different schools of thought at that time. Okay, so it depends. Okay, it depends on whether you're an orthodox Theravada, you will take everything from the Theravada tradition. Okay, let's see. Okay.
Rabbi, you missed out 2 questions in the earlier one.
Okay, let's see. Let me get back to the first 2 questions.
The screen now.
Let me see if I could see the 2 questions.
Share the screen.
Oh, did Dr. Ambedkar and Mahatma Gandhi shared any common views? Well, actually, they don't. They don't. Read that book which I recommended, the one written by Sankarashita. They were not the best of friends. Okay. In fact, Ambedkar subsequently came out to start his own political party, right? But he wasn't very successful as a politician. Yeah. So they had the falling out with Mahatma Gandhi. Yeah. Well, both of them shared the same shall I say same approach towards ahimsa. Okay. Right. Okay. There was another question. Was Nalanda University destroyed during the Arab invasion? Yes. Yeah. So it is said that it was destroyed by the Arabs. In fact, there was a name. Can't remember if I have it there. Yeah, I think it was said that it was the name of. That's what's the name of the book? I don't remember. It's called Hutchinson's Story of the Nations. Yeah, if you are interested in this, Story of the Nations by James Maston. It was James Maston. Yes, James Maston. Hutchinson's Story of the Nations. It's a book, right? Story of the Nations, where he said that it was this Turkish general. His name was Muhammad Khilji. He not only massacred Buddhist monks in Bihar, but he destroyed both Nalanda, and there's another very famous university called Vikramashila. Some of you may have heard. Of course, you are familiar with Nalanda University, yeah? But there's another very famous called Vikramashila. I think that's where Atisha was from too, yeah. So in Hutchinson's Story of the Nations, yeah, by James Maston, so it is said that this Muslim Turkish general, Muhammad Khilji, he destroyed both Nalanda and Vikramashila universities. So if you want more details, please make reference to this to this book, Story of the Nations by James Maston. Okay. Right. It's almost 10. Okay. Yeah. So as I said, we are trying to cover what, you know, the decline of Buddhism in India. There were 4 or 5 main factors. Each factor we could spend the whole evening talking about it, right? But especially that part on Buddhism, you know, been assimilated into Hinduism. And for example, this word Tantra. I think you have heard of the word Tantra, right? So there's a big difference between Buddhist Tantra and Hindu Tantra. Right? Of course, we don't have time to go into that, but this is something for your information. I remember many years ago when I was doing this book called 108 Treasures for BGF, and I requested His Holiness the Dalai Lama to write a foreword for the book, which he did. And in his foreword, he mentioned something to me which I always remember, because I mentioned the word Tantra, and he explained to me quite detailed that there's a big difference between Buddhist Tantra and Hindu Tantra. And it was because people in India at that time didn't realize the difference between Hindu Tantra and Buddhist Tantra, that people thought it was the same. And all the corruptions went into Buddhism. And I also remember one very interesting story which Atisha Dipankara mentioned when he was in Tibet, after leaving Indonesia, when he was in Tibet. And when he was in Tibet, he got news that his teacher in India, Shangtipa, had died, had passed away. And then he shed tears. So his disciple asked Atisha, "Why do you shed tears?" He said, "I shed tears because there were only 2 persons in India left who could distinguish between between Buddhism and Hinduism. And one of them has died. And I'm not in India, I'm in Tibet." Okay, so it was a terrible time in India when everything was so, you know, was so corrupted, right? No one really knew what was Buddhism. Okay. So Atisha, when he went to Tibet, the first thing he did was to revamp Buddhism in Tibet and started the Kadampa tradition, which was very much to bring back monasticism, to follow back the Vinaya, you know, and it was the Kadampa tradition that today we have the Gelug tradition, which is Holiness the Dalai Lama, you know, subscribes to. Okay, so that's just a little distraction, but yeah, okay. Okay, I think it's almost 10. Okay, thank you very much, and I hope it has been useful, but more useful would be some of the references that I have for you. Thank you very much, and take care.